Pratte is our next chair, and he is a senior manager of transportation and biofuel policy at the Canadian Canola Growers Association, and he's worn many hats and wears many hats in terms of technical committees he works on, and is an old friend of the Fields on Wheels and has chaired sessions as well as presented before. But I'd also like to point out that he is a longtime member of the Canadian Transportation Research Forum and today the 50th president of the Canadian Transportation Research Forum. So thank you very much, Paul, and I'll turn this over to you.
Thanks, Barry. And so everyone, welcome to our fourth session where we're going to look into trade measures and armed conflict. And so in the next, I guess it's now 54 minutes, we'll have two presenters with us this afternoon, and they're going to each be exploring and discussing two separate issues under the session's theme. So from my mind, in this case, the tie that binds these two topics together is the role that each of these, be it trade restrictions or armed conflict, really plays as a vector of change, and how they introduce uncertainty and volatility into markets, just potentially disrupting export access and resulting in supply chain challenges for both Canadian and global grain markets and their established trade flows. So in terms of format, as we've done earlier in today's conference, we'll have both presenters provide their remarks, approximately 20 minutes each, and then we'll open the floor at the end and for questions and comments and discussion amongst everyone. So again, please put your comments in the chat format at the bottom, and I'll pose the questions to the panelists and sustain that dialogue. So really, I mean, this is a very timely session in my mind, as for those working in this industry or those observing it can appreciate, there have been a number of high-profile bilateral or even multilateral trade issues arising in the last several years affecting Canadian grain products and their trade into certain export markets. And more acutely, the conflict in Eastern Europe is now into its 10th month. And as the region's a major global supplier of cereals and oilseeds, this has caused some volatility, sending reverberations through the global grain commodity market, and certainly at the outset caused concerns of food security for those traditionally dependent on those products from those regions. I'm confident in our time that we have here with our two presenters, they'll leave us with better appreciation of the current developments and perspectives on issues related to their respective areas of expertise. So with that, let us turn to our first presentation focused on market disruptions caused by growing trade restrictions. And I'm pleased to introduce Claire Citeau, the Executive Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Trade Alliance, or CAFTA. In this role, Claire advocates for trade liberalization and competitive market access to Canadian agri-food exports through bilateral and multilateral free trade agreements. And Claire has a background in international trade, policy, and government relations. So Claire, welcome to the 27th Fields on Wheels, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will ask Chris's help with putting the slides on the screen. Thank you very much for having me. I have to apologize in advance if I get kicked out. My internet access has been very unstable over the last half hour or so. So I'm hoping I stay with you here. So, all right, it's a pleasure to be here and with so many people who share a passion for trade and advancing the interest of Canada's ag and food sector. I'm going to be focusing today on the link between global trade and the current context and some of the challenges and opportunities from a trade policy perspective. This is what CAFTA does. Our focus is really on trade policy, the elimination of tariff and non-tariff barriers for agri-food. Certainly, we live in a world that is struggling with the international rule of law and how to enforce it. And for the people that do the trade, the exporting, this certainly creates risks, but also perhaps opportunities as well. Briefly about CAFTA. CAFTA is the voice of Canadian agri-food exporters, representing the 90% of farmers who depend on trade and the ranchers, producers, processors who want to grow the economy through better access to international markets. So that's the beef, pork, meat, grains, cereals, oilseeds, pulses, canola, sugar, malt, and processed foods industries. It's about 9% of what Canada exports in terms of ag and food, which last year reached a record 70 billion in exports. Ultimately, viable and real access is what translates into commercial opportunities for farmers and food manufacturers and the workers and communities they support. So like most people in the world of trade, I tend to be an optimist, but I apologize in advance if some of my remarks seem a bit gloomy. But I think it's important to recognize and deal with the challenges that are ahead of us and impede our ability to take advantage of opportunities. Very quickly here, I don't need to sell anyone here on the importance of trade, but I just wanted to share a bit of a few numbers that we do share on a regular basis with parliamentarians and those on Parliament Hill here in Ottawa. As we know, Canada is one of the few countries in the world with an ag and food sector that is inherently dependent on trade. Exporting is not a choice, it is a requirement. So 90% of Canadian farmers rely on trade. And we do export over half of our production. That's at least half of our beef and cattle, 70% of our soybeans, 70% of our pork, 95% of our canola, and about 40% of our processed foods. About 1 in 2 jobs in Canada in crop production depend on trade, and that's about 1 in 4 in the food manufacturing sector. Exports help agri-food grow. Over the last 30 years, our exports have grown by 103%, boosting from cash receipts over the same period of time by about 61%. And this massive growth is fueled by manufacturers, but it is anchored in one major reality. Canadian agri-food is world-class, and we have what we grow and make is in huge demand around the world. Very quickly here, as you know, the economic case for free trade is beyond reproach. Open markets lead on balance to rising global incomes, and agri-food trade in Canada accounts for a fair amount of Canada's GDP and total merchandise trade. Thank you. Here, I wanted to make a quick point because I find that it is not widely known. Canadian farmers, yes, and food manufacturers take pride in feeding families in Canada and around the world. And I think it is really remarkable throughout COVID that with most of the world on lockdown, global agri-food markets remain relatively stable. This is in part because government around the world recognize that keeping borders open to agri-food trade was vital. It is really the free flow of inputs, people and products and ingredients around the world that has helped maintain the stability of a highly integrated network, and that helped the system remain somewhat resilient. No pun intended, agri-food trade saved our bacon. And this is why up until the start of COVID and up until now, you see major international organizations and governments around the world, the FAO, the WTO, the UN, the OECD, leaders of the G7, G20, and others are clear about what needs to happen around the movement of food around the world, which remains really critical for the resilience of supply chains and for global food security as well. Today, 1 in 6 people around the world depend almost entirely on trade to be fed. That's about 17% of humanity. And if you roll the clock forward to 2050, that number will be about 50% of humanity. So we do need more and better trade. Overall, we have good success. Exports are growing. Canada is the 5th exporter of food products in the world for a good reason. We have a robust regulatory system recognized around the world, leading practices in innovation, stability, technology, clean tech, a vast amount of natural resources, a system with lots of capacity and ability to adapt to market demands. And yes, part of the equation is to accelerate our trade corridor infrastructure. Ports, rail, shipping, distribution centers are part of that equation. One thing that we often hear is Canada's agri-food exports are growing. What's the matter? And I have to say, with the greatest amount of respect, that we need to be nuanced in our analysis of increased exports. While we're pleased to see our exports growing, Canada's share of the global market remains overall stagnant. We remain the 5th largest exporter of food products in the world, and we have been in this position for several years, but we were in the top 2 in the past, if you look at the past 20, 30 years. So I think it's important to review export numbers carefully and consider additional statistics and data as measures of our success globally. Practically, this means measuring our growth against the water share of the market, against the growth of our key competitors, the US, Australia, the EU, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, and others, and also perhaps against also the cost of leveraging the access promise. So this means also looking at other factors such as commodity prices, production, assessing the value of exports against the volume of exports. One thing we need to be careful overall when we look at stats, and we should not just simply draw conclusions. So if we look at the, sorry, if we look at the global context, and according to the WTO, trade growth is slowing, and it is likely to continue to slow for the rest of 2022 and throughout 2023 as the global economy continues to face strong headwinds. There are a few major drivers of the growing trade tensions that we are seeing around the world, and I presume that none of these will be really new to you. The lingering effect of the pandemic. For many countries, the response to COVID was well-intentioned but misguided, in that countries began to believe self-sufficiency was the answer. Whether it was PPE, food, medicine, other essentials, the gut instinct was to do less business around the world and really depend less on others. The simplicity makes sense, but if we stop selling around the world and think we'll have more at home here, we may not need as many imports. But for a country like Canada that is highly integrated with supply chains across North America and elsewhere around the world, that is also the 6th importer of food products in the world, and that has a limited growing season, this is a challenge. Overall, globally, the result has been alarming. And over 200 export restrictions were quickly adopted around the world, with many restrictions affecting agri-food in particular. If we look at the Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, it has also had a major impact on global stability of markets, even among trading nations. Since the start of the war, over 78 trade restrictive measures have been introduced by 33 WTO members since the start of the war. From food to energy to healthcare supplies and medicine, real damage has been done. And there is much work done behind the scenes in Geneva and elsewhere to make sure that the unraveling does not happen, because it is a real worry. Third, I think about almost everyone is feeling the sting of record high inflation, and this also is affecting global trade, prices, and volume. And all of the above have been fueling supply chain disruptions across the global economy. From car parts to crop inputs, supply chains are under stress like never before. And it's gotten so bad that now various international bodies, including the UN, the FAO, the WTO, are warning about the potential of a full-blown global food crisis. And the question right now of access, in particular to fertilizer and food trade, is top of mind of many governments around the world, in particular ahead of the next planting season. If we look at, if we look at the past 3 years, things have been challenging and tumultuous, to say the least, but they are somewhat on trend with what the sector has been experiencing over the past 20 years. Trade in agri-food around the world has tripled over the past 20 years, a period of significant liberalization through free trade agreements. So we have seen tariffs go down through free trade agreements, but at the same time, we have seen non-tariff barriers go up. And the number of notifications at the WTO on technical barriers has tripled in the past 20 years. And we do have estimates of the cost implications of some of these non-tariff measures that are the equivalent, roughly, of a tariff of 25 to 30% in Asia and 30 to 40% in Europe. Many reasons for this, three primarily. First, the increasing importance people place around the world on their food, not only its food safety, but also increasingly how it is produced. The fact that also non-tariff barriers become apparent once barriers are eliminated through free trade agreements. And a third category, which is perhaps the most problematic and happens often without a warning, or scientific rationale, and is usually in response to internal pressures. So domestic industry, foreign partners will seek relief from import competition and will put pressure on the government to adopt certain measures. And I would say that geopolitical will fall in this category. I should note that not all regulations and technical measures act to restrict trade. Many of them are to address legitimate health and safety objectives, but a number are not used this way. Today, globally, it is the World Trade Organization that continues to set the rules for trade. But the global trade policy regime for agriculture remains uncertain and really challenged today. It is under a massive amount of stress. 4 years to this day, 4 years ago to this day, you may recall that the WTO's appellate body ceased to be fully functional, and CAFTA and like-minded partners rang the alarm bell a number of times. So as you may recall, the US has blocked the replacement of judges appointed to the appellate body, the highest authority in the WTO's dispute settlement, to the point where there are no judges to hear appeals. So what happens is country A takes up a case, they win. Country B wants to appeal, but there's no appellate body to appeal to, and they can appeal into the vote. So this is more or less like a hockey game where the referee is forced to leave the ice. Teams will play in good faith until boundaries get tested, and who knows what happens next. So same here, the unraveling is a big concern. And it is a concern because in large part, the trust among trading partners is eroding. The WTO is only able to function when there is trust amongst its members. The Latin formula pacta sunt servanda, which means agreements must be kept, is the oldest principle of international law, explicitly mentioned in all free trade agreements. And without this principle, no agreement would be binding or enforceable. And it does provide the basis for achieving the liberalization goals espoused by the WTO. And this is what is eroding today. So as I mentioned, with no appellate body, the WTO is not able to fully resolve trade conflicts between member states and may even lead to more disputes as countries take it upon themselves to adhere to rulings or not. So we see this at the WTO, but elsewhere as well. And here I'd like to share a quote by the former OECD chief economist, Lawrence Boone, who stated, "What looked like temporary trade tensions are now turning into a long-lasting new state of trade relationships. The global order that regulated trade is gone, and we are now in a new era of less certain, more bilateral, and sometimes assertive trade relations." And this is not really new. You will recall that the ink was barely dry on CUSMA when the US began imposing new tariffs on steel and aluminum. In Europe, only 14 of the member states have ratified the CETA after 5 years of provisional implementation. In the midst of the lockdown, some of you will know that Italy renewed mandatory country of origin labeling, even though it discriminates against Canadian durum and is even offside with EU law. And in the wake of diplomatic tensions, China banned a variety of agricultural products from Australia a couple years ago. Many of you know that agri-food farming is a business run by business people. And what anyone in business needs is policy stability, policy predictability, transparency, a level playing field, a fair chance to compete. The war in Ukraine certainly created disruptions, and this is on top of all the challenges that we are already facing with our major trading partners, including the US, China, the EU, Mexico, and others. Instability and uncertainty now reign. Impacts are further exacerbated by the realities of climate change. 1 minute, farmers are facing droughts. The next, they are dealing with drought, fire, and floods. And we must recognize that ultimately, it is actions by government to restrict trade of food that undermines confidence in the resilience of global food system. Today, perhaps one of the major worries is that protectionist measures will continue in the name of food security. And part of the problem is that science is no longer enough. We have to constantly demonstrate and provide the rationale and number and come up with good and better data. I'd like to now switch gears a bit and inject a bit of optimism into the discussion today and talk about why I'm hopeful that things can get back on track, at least to some extent. First, the WTO is slowly, but it is making headway on some very key issues. At the most recent WTO Ministerial Conference, which is also known as MC12 last June, there were some important developments that took place. A declaration on sanitary and phytosanitary measures, a commitment from all members to work together to combat food insecurity. Sorry. Those are some of the starting points. Yes, it was disappointing that members did not reach a substantial agreement on agriculture negotiations, but we're hopeful that this can take place hopefully soon. Closer to home, a major development, I think in Canada, for example, is the release of the Indo-Pacific strategy from the government of Canada. It is home to some of the world's largest and fast-growing markets and represent a significant opportunity for Canada to diversify its agri-food exports and grow its footprint in that region. Two elements in particular in the strategy are important. First, the recognition that it's important to build and strengthen and sustain relationships with key trading partners, but to also have boots on the ground and do advocacy in concert with industry from the market. The creation of an agriculture dedicated office hopefully will tackle some of the barriers and will help make sure that issues don't become problems. Another aspect here that I think is quite encouraging, if you look at globally, and this is true in Canada as well, the pace of free trade negotiations around the world has really picked up. Canada is engaged in negotiations with the UK, with CPTPP partners on possible new entrants to the CPTPP platform. We also have ongoing negotiations with Indonesia, the ASEAN group of countries, and India. Even though it's a negotiation that was started a long time ago, it was recently sort of revived. And I think this is an important and development and a testament to the importance of trade as an economic, not only as an economic driver, but as a way to strengthen relationship with key trading partners around the world. I think we truly believe at the CAFTA table that as a trading nation, we certainly can do best when we embrace free and rules-based trade. And I think many like-minded organizations agree to that belief. Global trade can help keep food plentiful and prices stable. If we are the largest agri-food exporter today, we certainly have an opportunity to leverage our resources to support more global food security around the world, but also increase our economic opportunity here at home. There are three particular areas of focus that we believe Canada should be looking at. The first one is the need to open new markets for Canadian agriculture and food by prioritizing trade talks with, I mentioned the UK, ASEAN, Indonesia. But we also need to look at how well we are doing with existing free trade agreements that we have implemented in recent years. The CETA, our deal with Europe, the CUSMA, the CPTPP. I think those big free trade agreements can tell us how well we are doing in delivering trade for the businesses and the people, and also the economy. But there's also many lessons that we can learn from doing better trade. So one of the asks of the association is to ask Parliament to do a review of free trade agreements that have been implemented in recent years. The second major area where we think Canada should be focusing on is on upholding the rules-based trading system. Yes, by increasing Canada's leadership in international fora at the WTO to ensure that trade agreements are implemented properly, but also to increase our influence within international standard-setting agencies like Codex, the OIE, and others. And then the third area is on the need to strengthen the collaboration between industry and government not only to improve accountability and transparency, but to make sure that opportunities are maximized and risk are mitigated. These are some of the recommendations that the CAFTA board is putting forward, and that represent enormous opportunities for Canadian agri-food exporters in global markets. As I mentioned earlier, Canada is an exporting nation. I often hear with so much pressure put on farmers and food manufacturing today, the sector is at a crossroad. And I like to say it's actually the sector is the crossroad and is in large part the answer to many of the problems that exist today. So we believe that some of these should be the focus, and there needs to be a bit ambition and vision attached with it. And we'll certainly continue to work with the government and private sector partners to make sure that this happens. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. So shifting gears, I'm pleased to introduce Neil Townsend. Neil's a chief market analyst at Farmlink, and he's a well-known analyst in the Canadian grain sector. I'm just going back, flipping through the archives last night. I noted that Neil last joined us at Fields on Wheels in 2020. And so Neil, welcome. Looking forward to your insights here as you unpack the details of your presentation. Floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Well, thanks a lot. And thanks to Claire for that illuminating presentation prior. I mean, I couldn't agree more that, you know, as the world becomes more uncertain and volatile, one response is more trade restrictions, more, you know, non-tariff trade barriers. And we have seen that, and all, you know, that's always a imminent risk to Canada. I also want to thank Field on Wheels. I mean, thanks a lot for having me back. I couldn't remember if I was here last year or the year before. And obviously, thanks to Barry Prentice. You know, I go way back with Barry. I've known him for many years. And when I was a young student at the University of Manitoba there doing ag economics, I remember being introduced to the, you know, the world of agriculture. I came from a sort of a legal background, and you know, I remember them telling me about this thing called an externality. And, you know, over the years, over the 25 years I've been in this industry, I've learned that, you know, when we talk about things like free trade or finding an equilibrium or whatever, I mean, we always have to remember that, you know, there's just so many externalities in agriculture, so many externalities in agricultural trade. And, you know, if you remove one, or if you know, heighten the energy of any specific externality, you know, you don't really know what the impact is going to be on all of the other externalities. And I think we live in sort of an era right now where we're seeing things that, you know, we really probably couldn't have guessed would happen accurately. Like, I'm not trying to defend or belittle like my own failures in calling the markets. I'm just saying it is difficult. And I always like to revert back to the coma test in situations like this. Is like, if you put me in a coma for 6 months and pulled me out of the coma and then started telling me certain things that happened, you know, it should be in a normal time, it should be relatively easy to go true or false. But I think in December of 2022, it's harder than ever. So if you pull me out of the coma 6 months from now and you tell me that, you know, there's been a nuclear accident and that, you know, North American wheat has gone up in value by, you know, $3 or $4 a bushel because the accident happened in Zaporozhye or something like that. Like, I can't just say, oh, well, false, you know. And if the war got worse, I also couldn't say false to that. I mean, you know, and there's just a lot of different things about that. But I wanted to start today quickly with, you know, a bit of an anecdote. And, you know, I used to do this anecdote for almost a little bit of a chuckle. And I sincerely should have probably apologized for that, because it's not really a funny thing. Now, it's personal. It's just me. But, you know, one of the things a lot of analysts and a lot of people have said is, well, you know, how did we know that Putin was going to invade? I mean, like, you know, we didn't think the war was going to happen. And of course, the great oversight in that commentary is that the war has been happening since 2014. And the world stood by and let Russia invade. They let them take Crimea. They let them take, you know, parts of the Donbass, parts of Luhansk. And, you know, we just sort of sat there and said, yeah, I guess that's the price of business, or, we were appeasers. We were all sort of like Chamberlain-esque. And, I've been to Ukraine about, 9 or 10 times. I've been to Russia 3 times. So, I have a little experience. I'm an expert by no means, but I have some experience. And, this happened in about 2015. So shortly after, the war began, and even I, not even I, but like I didn't really take the consequences as seriously as I should have. And, at that time I was traveling, looking at the wheat crop. So we were down in this region south of Kherson, which is now occupied by Russians. And we came across, we were just north of Crimea driving around, and, the red thing represents the North Crimean Canal. Crimea is a place that doesn't have a lot of fresh water. And I'd been in this region, as I said, like 7 or 8 times I'd driven along. And one thing I'd never seen was I never saw the canal short of water. And I was looking into it and I was like, whoa, that's very interesting. I mean, and of course, I thought I'll take a picture of that because, that normally always has water in it because that's the source of water for Crimea. And so I jumped out of the car. The guy that I was with a Ukrainian agronomist and a Ukrainian sort of like handler driver guy like that I had hired. These both very good guys. I started to kind of try to position myself for a picture. And lo and behold, I noticed that, while I was setting up for my picture, not with a tripod or anything, just like using my phone, 4 guards were running at me from a little guard shack. And so just, again, as I said, I used to play this for laughs, but it's the message is still important that this was a wartime and not to be taken lightly. But the other message is the comments that you are about to hear are going to come from a person who is dumb enough to walk into a minefield. So this says stop mines. And just bear that in mind when you're listening to the rest of my comments. One of the things, of course, and it's been mentioned a few times here today is, notions of the food crisis and all those kinds of things. And, that people are going to starve and to die because of the war. I think one thing that is often lost in that conversation is that, nobody really on Earth is currently starving because there's not enough food on Earth. It's a distribution logistical thing. And I mean, Field on Wheels, obviously, we know best about logistics and the challenges of logistics and how this needs to be sorted out. But of course, something like a war where, people noted, oh, this is the #1 wheat exporter and the #5 wheat exporter. This is a very important thing. It's sort of, it makes front page news. And, nobody was writing about the people who were struggling for food, prior to the war. And let me tell you, like everybody who was starving prior to the war or having struggles with nutrition before the war, probably still struggling today. So, it's not something that it might have been made a little bit worse for sure. But, this is an ongoing problem and a human issue that, we haven't found a way to solve in sort of, the last 50 to 100 years. So we're not going to solve it today. Partly because we simply don't have the will to solve it. But, the Economist took some interest in, they had a little thing called the coming food catastrophe. And you see, oh, there's some nice wheat things. If you look closer at the wheat, it's actually little skulls. So, that because of the war, in part, and some other things, climate change, whatever, I mean, there's more people vulnerable, maybe. I mean, I definitely think climate change has made a lot more people vulnerable, but I'm not sure the war has made people more vulnerable who weren't vulnerable already. And again, that's bad and worse. But of course, the market reacted and, wheat prices got to, this is the Chicago contract. We got to sort of like a nearby record probably an all-time record of where it was. And it quickly faded, and it's faded even further from here since then. So, Chicago wheat contract today, March, is down in the mid 7s. So, we've fallen off a little bit more. And there doesn't seem to be a panic about the wheat. And I'll get into the reasons why there's no panic on the wheat. And you can see, here's where we were in May 22. That's when, the Economist put out their newspaper. with that graphic on it. And, here's Minneapolis. And again, we didn't spike as much as we spiked back during, the 2008 season, but, we certainly spiked quite a bit. And, we've come off quite a bit, and currently, spring wheat's trading, at about $9.20 for the March contract. So we're down about another 30 cents from when this was. And, wheat went, it was relatively cheap down here. We forget these years. I mean, like, if you were to ask a farmer right now, like, what were the prices in 2021, 2020, a lot of people have said, oh, I think they were about $8, $9. People forget they were down in the $5 range. We were really struggling, and, never, ever, ever underestimate farmers. We give them a lot of incentive. Could happen multiple years ago, and, they're still sort of like able to produce. And of course, most people are, in typical times, they're trying to yield their way to profitability, not so much score the high price, but a combination of high prices and high yields would be ideal. And you can see, like, we don't know, we're maybe at an inflection point so far since this, since this graphic was made. We've struggled, we've gone down a bit. The range hasn't been huge. We're only down about 30 cents, but that's the issue. And going forward, what are we going to look at? And obviously, the Ukraine-Russia situation is going to play a big part in how it all turns out. We don't know when the war is going to end. I mean, it's going to end by some form of negotiation. That is how wars end. Right now, their BATNA, their best alternative to a negotiated agreement, is still to keep fighting. Ukraine is not ready to give up land, and their ask is all land back to the pre-2014 borders. I mean, then you get into this whole issue of Crimea. To me, Crimea, it was part of Ukraine. Whether or not it's populated by Ukrainians is another issue. I don't know. But, it's going to be a very difficult thing to solve because, Russia had those plebiscites, illegal and, pretty, funny if you really look at them. 4 regions joined Russia once and forever. Again, I don't know if the people in Kherson Oblast or Zaporizhzhia Oblast are going to, was that a legitimate vote? Like, not in any way, but how do you solve these things, right? And again, we're going to see later as we come out. Now, of course, it's not just about Ukraine and Russia. We're going to have to watch a lot of other things. U.S. supply is declining, but, U.S. Wheat exports are at a record low, like an all-time record low for this time of season. And again, their marketing year is winding down. They're in the second half of their marketing year. And, they had a relatively okay exports today, but, they're not, nothing really that should be too exciting for us. So, there's that issue. And typically when we look at the price of wheat in terms of a sustainability, it's somewhat correlated with how much of the world residual gets traded. And the bulk of the world residual resides within the United States. So we're monitoring currency. The Canadian dollar dropped a bit today, which, is usually seen as a positive for Canadian farm gate returns, a negative for input costs. The oil markets have been up and down and all around. They're sort of in the mid 70s right now after spending a lot of time in the 80s. And, of course, we're watching various weather patterns around the world. The most important weather pattern right now is probably in South America, not so much for wheat, but for corn and soybeans. But, that's really going to dictate where the base level of crop trading will be as we go forward to 23, 24. So when we look specifically at, the Black Sea, what happened to the war premium? Why did the war premium disappear so quickly? And I get, the great opportunity to talk to a lot of Western Canadian farmers, and that's the most often question I get. It's not so much that people were cheering for war. No, certainly not. We're not cheering for the war, but we thought, based on all of the information we had, that, when 2 major agricultural export powers are engaged in, a pretty unprecedented war since World War II, that, in Europe at least, that there would be more long-lasting, price, premium for that, but it's sort of evaporated, and we're trading now at actually lower values than prior to the war. There's 3 main crops. There's some other ones too that we could talk about, and I'm only going to really talk about wheat here. wheat, corn, sunflowers are the three main crops that were impacted by the war. I mean, Ukraine also grows some rapeseed, canola, yes. And there's definitely they produce other things, but these are the main traded crops. And in sunflowers, it's a byproduct that's traded for the most part, the sunflower oil. But, on the wheat, I mean, both of them are very critical exporters. And, what happened? Like the first thing I think that happened is that, for a bunch of reasons, I don't know if it's the right reasons or the wrong reasons, but right away, the world and, the European Union and the UN and the FAO and all, they try to impose some order on a actually chaotic, uncertain, volatile situation. And, they were right away very concerned about, all the people who had food insecurity to begin with. Now, maybe we weren't listening. Maybe their concern was the same as it's always been, and they were worried about the war. But, it just seemed that, again, there is always wheat that's able to be traded in the world. And if we want to pay the price, we can get wheat to the areas where, the people have the most food insecurity. Now, of course, there's a heavy correlation between people in food insecurity and often conflict. So, yes, people are struggling for food in Ethiopia and Tigray and along the Eritrean border, but, the cost of us to get the food there is, a safety concern or something like that. I mean, that didn't go away, or it wasn't created by the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I mean, it still exists. And so one of the things they came up with, we all heard about it, was this export corridor where, okay, we're going to allow the vessels that are within Ukraine to get out and more vessels to get in. Russia wanted to be able to inspect the vessels both on the way in and the way out. Around the time that there was a strike on the Crimean naval base, the Russians decided that they were going to cancel the corridor. Eventually, they were convinced to restore the corridor and then to extend the corridor for another 120 days. But, the games continued to get played with, the inspection. Some days, many boats get inspected. Other days, only one boat gets inspected. And the big problems are on the way out. That's where the slower pattern seems to be going. But it's working. I mean, Ukraine is exporting wheat. They're probably going to export more than what the USDA forecasts. And Russia has got some other concessions. They've gotten some, concessions on banking related to agricultural transactions. And the Russians have also been extremely successful at exporting their crop. Now, this time of year, specifically December and January, is a time of year of very high winds on the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. So the Russian export total for December won't be quite as glorious as it was for November or October. But, that's not a byproduct of the war. It's simply like the environmental conditions, which, tend to exist every day. And I mean, the average wind speed at Kerch right now is about 25 miles an hour, which I don't know how fast that is, but it's enough to really delay the loading and reloading of boats. A lot of the boats start out, or the wheat starts out on small vessels, 2,000-3,000 tonners, and they meet up with larger vessels sort of at sea, I guess you'd say, and then they transload them from those smaller vessels onto, a bigger vessel that will go across the Black Sea, through the Dardanelles and off to, the different destinations. These inspections, again, I mean, Russia will never miss a trick to kind of exert power. And we continue to let them exert power. So they have the right to inspect, even though in that brief period of time where there was no corridor, it had been canceled. One thing that was clearly evident is the ships, as long as you could get insurance and ship owners and crews that were willing to do it, the Russians had no means to stop it. And it was going to continue, in fact, more unfettered than the export corridor. So the Russians came back to the negotiation table pretty quickly because they didn't want that precedent to be set too much. When will the war end? I mean, I really don't know. Some people that I talk to think it's in its last legs. Other people think it's going to be a grind and it's going to be, with us for multiple months going forward and even potentially multiple years. Right now is the time of season where, Ukraine's planted their winter crops. About 35% of the Ukraine territory for wheat is within the war zone or adjacent to the war zone. Only about 5% of their corn area is within the war zone or adjacent to the war zone in any immediate way. All of the crops are obviously going to be impacted by, the road conditions, the rail conditions, the power outages, these kinds of things, the availability of inputs like fertilizer and diesel, etc. About 40% of the Ukrainian crop is currently still in the field. So, what will they do with that? We're not sure. And that has direct implications about how much they're going to be able to plant and harvest in 2023, 24, and really, I think because they planted most of the winter wheat in 2021 prior to the war starting, we didn't really see a huge, there was an impact, but there's potentially much larger impact on production in 2023 than there will be in 2022. Corn was impacted for sure, but as I mentioned, a smaller proportion is in the immediate war zone. So here's the situation according to the USDA. I'm winding down now. I'll make these slides available to the organizers, and if people want to look at them, they can look at them. So for 2022, 23, according to the USDA, the wheat exports are going to be, fairly steady out of the region, 42 million for Russia, 11 million for Ukraine, and 9 million for Kazakhstan, which is actually a slight increase over last year. And the bulk of that increase is coming from Russia, obviously. Now, the USDA only has them at 91 million tons production. A lot of analysts are at 100 million tons or higher. I am, in my experience, the best entity that estimates for the Black Sea region is the USDA. Now, I don't know why they're still at 91. Everybody thought, oh, maybe they'll change it in the December WASDE, or maybe they'll change it, maybe they'll change it in January. I don't know. But I also can see why Russia might want to have a storyline of, that they did grow 100+ million ton crop. I also can see a storyline as to why they want to be aggressive on exports and export 45 to 50 million tons of wheat. First of all, it's soft power. You keep a lot of your customers happy because you're giving them wheat that without that wheat, the world market price would be much higher. Second thing, it is a source of, hard currency, which is something that, Russia, even with their massive oil and gas reserves, they still need, more things. Now, again, why do we care how much they grew and how much they export? I mean, for a lot of reasons, but one reason is that, we are concerned about grain stocks, because the magnitude and direction of grain stocks are going to tell you, as a fundamental, what you can expect for prices going forward. And you can see that, what under the USDA scenario, grain stocks in Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan are growing back to one of the higher levels they've been in the last 15 years. And that would be like, okay, that means next year they have a, average weather trend yield crop. They're going to be aggressive exporters. There's going to be more wheat. Prices are going to go down further. Again, this is even with the war, you'd say that, because they've proven that they can export despite the war. And in the second scenario, I've just increased their exports to 46 million, increased Ukraine by 2.5 million, kept Kazakhstan the same at 9 million. You can see that's almost a record export scenario, if not a record export scenario for any one marketing year. And then, I've added in the 100 million ton production. You can see a record production for the three of them, an unambiguous record production for Russia. The one thing that changes, and again, has implications for the 23-24 marketing year, is that the ending stocks for those three countries are much lower, meaning that, now you get into the point where if there is a falter or if there's something goes wrong within the Russian wheat production, and we've already heard that winter wheat plantings are down. We've heard that they had some severe winter weather. Maybe there's been some winter kill. We've heard the government of Russia themselves say between 80 and 85 million. These are question marks. And again, why do their stocks matter? Well, because if you look at the big eight, which is, including the EU, US, Canada, Australia, Argentina, the trend is down. If you take out the three, Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, because it's just too uncertain, I don't know, that trend is very decidedly down in 22-23, which means that the next cycle of wheat crop does matter for, prices. And, if you want to say it, it matters for food security in the world, and it's coming down quite aggressively. So just in finishing up, I'll just say that, here's two scenarios for Russia for next year. One is like saying that the USDA is correct. It's 91 million and they produce an 82 million ton crop. And what you see is that their exports, their ending stocks and their days of use that they have start to get somewhat tighter, not emergency level tight, but this means they have to produce an 82 million ton crop. If for whatever reason they produce a 75 or 77 million crop, which, again, they produced a 75 million crop 2 years ago. They produced, they've only been above 80 like 3 times prior to this year. So it's, they might be, I would bet that they probably could be, but, if they start to get lower, they start to get into like a slightly tighter predicament. And then if you go with, the bigger one of 100 million and they hit 82, it's a much smoother outcome. And, the world probably rests a little bit easy on overall wheat supply and all that kind of thing. And again, this is assuming that Russia remains, for all of their, colossal faults, we continue to say, hey, Russia, it's okay to trade wheat. It's okay to trade, barley. Just keep shipping it out. Yes, we won't use your oil, but we'll provide it cheaply to other countries to use it. So we're still doing a lot of business with Russia, despite the circumstance of them being, in my mind, the clear 100% aggressor in the current situation. So just finally, just some points to remember: the war is not over. I think wheat is amazingly resilient, both in terms of cropping and in the trade realm. And this is my point about, sort of the Economist magazine and the international organizations, that, farmers are going to grow wheat. They're going to get, as big a yields as they can. And if the price goes up, they're going to grow wheat anywhere. Plus, if the price goes up, you're going to see wheat exports potentially come from a multitude of countries that we're not used to having them come from. South Africa or India was exporting for a little bit this year until they realized that their own crop had burnt up from excessive heat. We can't forget, it is a human disaster in Ukraine. People are living under very rough conditions. People are being killed. And despite the resilience of everything, farming and logistics are going to be harder than they are today, probably. It's not, until the war is over, it doesn't look like they're going to improve. And, there can't be much investment going on right now in building new terminals or new rail cars or repairing the railroads or repairing the roads. The focus is on very much providing the basics for the people who are in Ukraine, food, water, and electricity. So that's difficult. World prices have dropped. That's good for end users. It's not great for Ukrainian farmers because the margins are actually quite tight in Ukraine. Costs are very high. So, with world prices dropping, we got to wonder about behavior in the farming community in Ukraine come the spring, when they might, be wanting to top dress their wheat or get ready for harvest. Could there be decisions made, that maybe walking away is cheaper than harvesting it? And there might be those situations, like, people have calculated that the farm gate price for corn in parts of Ukraine is like around about $100 US or even lower, which doesn't cover the cost of production. That's one reason why 40% of the crop is not harvested right now. Like, they don't want to spend the money on the diesel to go do it. So, we got to watch that. What is the potential going forward? This isn't a satisfactory answer, but as always, it really depends. And, again, we don't know what the outcome will be. So with that, I thank you very much for your time. I thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this conference. And I'll answer a few questions along with Claire, but thank you.
Thanks, Neil. And thank you, Neil, for that presentation. Claire, thank you for your presentation. Both very interesting from my lens. I'm actually kind of shocked we don't have any questions for our two panelists coming in on the chat. Barry, maybe we just give it 10 seconds. We had two very thought-provoking presentations there. I know we're eating into the next panel, but if we have anyone with a burning question for either Claire or Neil, we could take it quickly here. Okay, I see one. So it's from Headley Ald. Neil, can you elaborate on the risks from the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant for Russian and Ukrainian production areas for field crops? How much of Ukraine's export terminal capacity has been destroyed? Any thoughts?
I think like in terms of outright destruction, probably, some, but that's not the main problem. The main problem is like, pre-war, a bunch of their capacity, is under control of Russia. So anything that's sort of like to the east of the Crimean Peninsula is no longer available for them. Now, most of the prime export capacity was in in the west of the Crimea. Now they did one of the places I've been to in Ukraine is Nikolaev, and visited Nibulon. Now the Russians did target and drop a bomb and kill the CEO of Nibulon very specifically. He was very pro-Ukrainian, obviously, because he was Ukrainian. So it is an all-out war.
Thanks. Maybe just one more quick one, Claire, this is for you, and then we'll turn the floor back to Barry. It's from Adam, and Adam says, I'm curious about Biden's America First trade position that he has recently outlined. What are the thoughts? Is this much to do about nothing or something that Canada should be concerned about?
I'm curious as well. And I don't have the details, but I will say overall, it is important every time the US does something when it comes to trade policy and foreign affairs overall to not only be, keep an eye, because the US is, yes, a major competitor and also a customer. That being said, Canada needs to have its own foreign policy and trade policy agenda. We did not wait on the US to have our own free trade agreement with Europe, for example. I think if you look at the global context, there may be reasons why the US is perhaps a bit more advancing its efforts right now with Africa. I hear Canada is considering its own plans in that region of the world as well. What and when they will be shared has yet to be seen. But certainly an interesting development and one to keep an eye on.
Okay, thank you. With that,
Steve, I see the first one. It said he elaborated on the risks from the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant for Russian and Ukrainian production areas. For again, I'm obviously not a nuclear scientist, but I think we should all be worried if anything like that happened, and it would have consequences for far beyond just the food supply. But in terms of the food supply, I mean, that would be pretty scary. Like Zaporizhzhia is right in the heart of the wheat area, so it's I've driven by that plant several times. I mean, unbeknownst to me that it would be a focal point of a war.
Thanks, Neil. Thanks for that comment. So Neil, Claire, really appreciate you joining us this afternoon. Unfortunately, we're at time. So thanks for your insight. And Barry, I'll pass the floor back to you for the last session of the day.
Thank you very much. And thank you to our speakers, Neil and Claire. It was really interesting. One of the things that I remember reading about is before the First World War, there was this belief that war was obsolete, that it could never happen again because the economic consequences were too great. And I think leading up to this situation we have in Ukraine, that view was also there in Europe, that there were just the consequences of the conflict were so great that there's no way the Russians could do this, and therefore, their energy sources, they could depend on Russia, which obviously turned out to be wrong. But what we do see at the same time is there are real consequences. I mean, Russia may be somewhat just a resource exporter, and we look at them that way, but it's a big impact in the world markets. And of course, Claire, your comments on the trade issues is really interesting too, because again, I thought we got to the place where everybody had agreed, no, tariffs were a bad idea, don't do that. Free trade is the way we have to go. And it seems like we've just been going backwards in the last half a dozen or years or a decade. So a really important session, and thank you very much for your contribution.